Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. So today, since it's Valentine's Day, I thought we could talk about romances and love situations in fantasy books. Now, this idea isn't my own. This comes from Brian Cook, who commented on one of my previous videos and suggested this topic. So thank you, my friend. Thank you so much for the topic. So today we're going to go ahead and talk about love coupling situations in fantasy. Some that I like, some that I don't like, some that I think are good examples, and some that I don't think are good examples. So, as always, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and let's begin. So let's start off and talk about what I think makes a good romance situation in a story. Primarily fantasy, like sci-fi, fantasy and sci-fi, because that's my main two genres. And, horror, but it's less common in horror. But so for me, I think a romance situation works best when it affects both characters as like their character arcs. So it has to be a significant part of their character arc, like say it's an example of progression, like it's an example of them getting over something, or it's an example of them like learning how to open themselves up more that results in them becoming a part of a relationship, getting in a relationship. So I think that would be a good, kind of motivator for the character, which also then ties into the actual plot arc. So the character arc and the plot arc. So it basically essentially needs to be incredibly relevant, I think. And it can't just kind of be a situation where these two people are near each other, so it's kind of inevitable, so it just kind of happens in that way. I don't really like those situations. I think they're kind of boring and just very, very predictable. So I really like the situations where it's like there's a lot of thought around it before it actually happens. So one good example I can give you is a fairly obscure example, only because the book series is fairly obscure, but it's the Superpowered series. I think this is a pretty good example of a plot-driven, character-driven kind of love story. So there's a character, Camille. She is in love with one of the main characters, Vince, and this is all based on them having had an interaction when they were children, and she kind of harbored a crush on them for like their entire lives, and then now they're in college and stuff and kind of reconnect with each other. So their relationship ends up blossoming in a way that helps her kind of come out of her shell as like a quiet, reserved person. That kind of helps her assert her assertiveness and dominance, because they're in a superhero school and she wants to be more of a combat focused person. So it kind of helps her character arc and it helps progress her entire storyline. And with Vince, it helps him kind of deal with a lot of his trauma from the past and a lot of situations that happened in the same time frame as when he originally met her. So it kind of helps him deal with his trauma, deal with his past, and grow as a person, and kind of help him do better also in the superhero training. So it's relevant to their plots as characters, but it also helps progress their plots as a part of the overall story. So I think that's a pretty good example of a way to do a romance coupling in a fantasy story. Pretty much any story, I think. I think these rules are very generic and they can kind of go across the board, whether it's horror, fantasy, even just pure romance story, or basic sci-fi, anything, pretty much all the gambit of it. So that's pretty much like the idea of what I think is a really good one. So I want to talk about some that I think are pretty bad, some crappy ones. So let me give a couple examples of those. So one of the older ones, well, I mean, it's old now by today's standards, but it's one of the first ones I don't know, it's one of the main first series I read, I guess. It's from Harry Potter. So I have a huge issue, well, not huge issue, but I have a bit of an issue with the Harry and Ginny romance relationship. I think it comes almost completely out of nowhere. In the books, they honestly do a little bit more to kind of feed, kind of to foreshadow the fact that she has a crush on him and stuff, like when they first meet in the second movie and stuff. But the books, I don't recall there being a whole lot of build up to anything like that. There wasn't enough groundwork, not in the way Ron and Hermione had groundwork, even though the way J.K. Rowling kind of situated that whole thing is a little messy, because she clearly could have gone with either one of those characters. But as a result, Harry was like the third wheel, so it felt like she just kind of needed to pair him off, so she just kind of threw him with Ginny. So like there was no plot progression, there was no character progression, there was no true connection between them that I felt, apart from like, I don't even know, she was more badass than him. I always kind of got that impression, so it didn't even really help him in terms of giving him more courage to do the stuff he did at the end of the series. It didn't really help her plot-wise at all, because she didn't really have her own, character plot, progression or anything. So to me, that entire romance, entire situation just kind of was there. It just kind of was like, these two characters are around, let's throw them together to end the series so that we can end the series with them being happily married and stuff. So I didn't care for that. I think it's a poorly done romance for that. So let's talk about another example of a pretty crappily done one. So this one comes from the Joe Hill, and I think it's just all Joe Hill. Yeah, it's not a co-written one. Stephen King's son wrote a story called The Fireman, which in my opinion is really just his version of Firestarter. It's like he had to do a version of, his dad's books. So he did Firestarter the same way Nosferatu is almost like his It. So like there's a lot of that in there. So there's a romance between one of the main characters, Harper, and the titular fireman. So it doesn't really go off into full romance, but it kind of builds in this way that just feels entirely too circumstantial. So she she was married in the beginning of the book, and situations of the plot actually caused that relationship to degrade and fall apart and everything. And it's like all these traumatic events and stuff that's happening to her and this group that she ends up with. So she just kind of latches onto him in this way because he eventually teaches the group to basically become pyrokinetic, to be able to control their fire and stuff. So it's like it's a circumstantial situation, and it just feels like she's latching onto him and not like they have any proper chemistry or backstory or any real depth of field to one another or any like growth together potential or anything like that. I mean, King kind of gets away from that by doing what he does at the end of the story, but it doesn't come together in the way that I would personally feel more satisfied by with the romance like that. Another sci-fi example that I don't think is done really well. I think it's done better than the previous example I gave, but I don't think it's done, very, very well. It has to be Chani and Paul from Dune. I don't really think their relationship makes a lot of sense. It's not as organic as it could be. It's literally like Paul only is interested in her because she's the subject of a prophetic dream he'd been having. So he saw that he was going to be with her, so by result he ended up liking her, and she just kind of likes him for all the prophecy kind of reasons and stuff. And then I don't know, there's no real development, there's no real showing of them really connecting, even though it's really implied that they have this great love affair and all this kind of stuff. Is an epic love, especially when you deal with Princess Irulan and how she was trying to move in on it and stuff. So it's an interesting dynamic because there's some of the stuff in it that I would like the way it progresses the plot and it progresses the story. It's almost a keystone of the entire Dune series. So it really very much does affect the plot and it affects the story in major ways. But as far as the coupling, as far as the two people actually coming together, I don't think it's done that well. I think it feels a little too convenient, and it's very much a plot convenience because it's necessary for the rest of the story. So I don't think it's done that well, but it's done a little better than some of the other examples. And my last example of bad ones is kind of a catch-all. Honestly, it's most of the romances in the Wheel of Time. Most of Wheel of Time is just instantaneous insta-love, and it's just so weird to me. It's so weirdly done, and it just feels like we're checking boxes. It's a lot of that it's a lot of that thing about the way Robert Jordan kind of wears his references on his sleeves in a lot of ways. There's a lot of Wheel of Time that is clearly referenced to Lord of the Rings and stuff, and just general kind of fantasy tropes. So it kind of feels like some of the romances are just that. Okay, we just need to do this. Okay, these characters, we can pair them off. Let's do that. But there's some other romances, as the series goes on, they're less insta-love and they're a little more interesting and they have a little more fun dynamics between them and stuff. So the series itself, I can't write off all the romances, but just some of them, especially in the early books that are just so instantaneous, I don't like them that much, and I think they could be done way, way better. And almost none of the romances really have a great effect on the plot. None of them really, some of them kind of progress character arcs, but none of them truly progress the plot. There's one that I guess you could kind of argue that it does, but it doesn't really. So yeah, that's why I gotta put that one on there. So I want to talk about two more kind of interesting romance situations that have happened in other book series that I like. So in Arcane Ascension, our main character, Corin, kind of develops romantic interest in this guy, Jin, who is, he's a fellow student. He's not like a dorm mate or anything. He's like a fellow student in the magical academy or whatever where he is. So this situation I think is interesting because it is, in a way, it is like Dune, where the relationship, the closeness of these two people is very much plot relative. It is specifically there to give a extra layer to the plot, but it also informs a lot on the characters. So it informs on the character of Jin in that he's more like a spy. He's kind of like he's very much a ninja, interesting kind of ninja type character, especially with his specializations in magic and stuff. He is very much a sneaky person. But it also kind of opens up Corn in this way because, similar to another example that I was talking about with Vince, he has a lot of trauma and stuff in his past and a lot of like emotional attachment issues and stuff. He's like very much hands off, like non-touchy and stuff. So just this kind of different type of relationship he's ever, experienced versus verbal and physical abuse from his dad and stuff like that. Like to have this kind of interesting dynamic with Jen and stuff. So it's kind of opening him up as a character to allow him to be a little bit of a more normal, I guess you would say, person, like a more typical kind of person that can express his emotions better, because even with his sister and his like closest friends and stuff, he doesn't really know how to express himself that well. So this kind of dynamic with Jen is kind of helping progress that, but the relationship never actually manifests truly. It's kind of used as a will they, won't they, in order to continuously progress the character and to progress the plot, because it's all tied into each other. So it's interestingly done, and it's not really a true relationship, but it kind of has this interesting dynamic that I really like what it's doing for the story. And I kind of hope it doesn't right now in the series, it feels like it's being strung out a little bit. So I'm hoping when Arcane Ascension do continue, it does kind of resolve itself. But I think that was a really interesting example. And another one is from the Red Rising series. So I really think that Darrow and Mustang's relationship is really interesting because there's this dynamic to it that wouldn't have existed in any other type of story. So because of the nature of where they're from and who they are and stuff, there's this little bit of a Romeo and Juliet aspect to it, but it's kind of like an ignorant Romeo and Juliet, if that makes any sense. Like there's this like they're not supposed to be together dynamic because Darrow is a red where she's a gold, but he's had modifications to make him a gold. So they're like they were enemies and stuff at first, so their entire dynamic was completely different. So the entire way that they come about as a couple is plot relevant. It is all because the way the characters are progressing through the plot, and his ability to be with her, Darrow's, is character arc progression because of his prejudice against the golds and stuff, and him having to deal with it by becoming one. So there's just a lot of actual plot progression, character progression, and just relevancy as to the way they get together. But the one thing that stops me from really calling it just a straight up good kind of romance is the fact that it feels like a situation similar to Harry and Jenny almost, in that they are conveniently near each other, so it just kind of becomes convenient for them to get together. So when he first started his whole mission and everything, that was one of the first people he interacted with in like the early days, like what I'm going to call freshman year basically. It was one of those people that he had a very specific type of interaction with, so it left an impression. So it just kind of, it held this like, because we're near each, I mean, granted, that's how a lot of relationships happen in real life, is like because of proximity, but like it has so much of that, especially in consideration of how many people Darrow interacts with and how much of the world and the universe is just populated at this point. So just the fact that he just so holds on to this person that he met briefly for an early period of time in his life, it just comes off as a little too convenient for me. So that's why I got to put it in one of the more interesting categories. So before we wrap up, let me give a couple examples of what I think are also pretty good romances and fantasy and sci-fi stories. So I've already mentioned that I think Vince and Cammy relationship in the Superpowered series is really well done. But there's also some relationships in multiple other series that I really like and think pretty much qualifies for those same stipulations that I put out already. So one of my favorite examples of a couple is in Stephen King's Dark Tower series is Susanna and Eddie Dean. So their relationship happens almost really quickly. It kind of happens in between books a little bit. It's like their progression from being friends to like immediately being married kind of thing. So they come from literal two different places in time and kind of two different Earths because it's all happening simultaneously, but they're from two very similar Earths just on two different time spans. So she's from the 60s and he's from like the 80s, and she's from a very, very horribly racially charged time. She's a civil rights activist and stuff, and she's a victim of racist hate crimes and all kinds of stuff. So she has this major, major prejudice and like hatred against white people and stuff. And Eddie is just basically a 1980s heroin addict who's on the wrong side of the tracks, like following his brother who led him into all kinds of terrible things. But when they get pulled into like the same situation because of all the Dark Tower shenanigans, they end up basically just connecting to each other, mostly similar in a way of proximity convenience, because they're both fish out of water. They both have no real logic or balance to hold on to, so they kind of end up holding on to each other. But they go through some majorly traumatic events and some major like character growth in such a holy crap, such a short amount of time. When you think about it, it's like instantaneous major character development. And then that's not even all their character development, because it keeps going throughout the entire series, which is why I love Dark Tower so much. But they go through some major character development in a short period of time, but together. So it creates this bond with them that is so completely believable and so well realized by King that they get married and they become like this really cool dynamic duo for the rest of the series. And it kind of just, it has all kinds of different implications. I can't wait till we get to that point in my re-review of the series, or my reread of the series. We can talk about it more. So yeah, my last really good example has to be, I think, Dalinar and Navani from the Stormlight Archive. So I want to talk about a little bit how both of their, how their relationship kind of affects their character arcs. So Dalinar has this whole major reservation about the impropriety of being with his former sister-in-law and stuff. And like, he's this staunch, rule-abiding kind of person. So it just has this major blockage right there. And he kind of thinks, like, if he doesn't do what he thinks he's supposed to do, he'll regret it and like have all these issues and stuff. But he kind of eventually grows out of that and realizes like he is a good man. Everything he does is great. Like, not great, but like everything he does is striving to be better, and like he needs to basically cut himself some slack. And he does deserve happiness because of all the stuff he's been through. And Navani kind of has to deal with the same issues with the whole stipulations, the social stipulations of it and stuff. But she also kind of has to forgive herself for the regret that she has for basically choosing the wrong brother, and for basically being afraid of Dalinar's intensity rather than like embracing it and stuff like that. So it feels very relevant to their plot, their character arcs, their like, them as people, and the plot itself. Like now, I mean, granted, Stormlight Archive isn't finished, so it's hard to, give it a whole hindsight look. But what's happening in the most recent books makes it feel like more now that their relationship is starting to have a major effect on the overall plot of the story, because now they are basically another epic fantasy series dynamic duo. So I'm really looking forward to see what happens with that next. So I think that's another really good example. What do you think makes a good relationship in a fantasy or sci-fi series? Notice I didn't really talk about romance series at all, because those are very much just about it. So if I was to talk about like the Dark Hunter series, the entire series is predicated on romance before everything else. So a lot of my criteria doesn't really fall into place with that a lot. So let me know in the comments down below, what kind of criteria do you all have for what makes a good romance or a good relationship in the book series? So as always, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and I will talk to you all next time. Peace.